We're here today in Santa Barbara, California, February 9th, 2012. With all these wonderful people. We're in front of the jail administration building. Somewhere behind that building, my son is in a solitary cell. His name is Ben Warren. He was first born with a severely injured right hand that ended up being surgically compromised the first 2 weeks of his life and has lived with that from birth. When he was 12 years old, he was diagnosed with a form of autism called Asperger's syndrome. He's been medicated since then, up until a year ago, to treat the Asperger. He also has incurred post-traumatic stress syndrome as a result of some exchanges he's had with different authority figures in Santa Barbara. When he doesn't take his medication, he lapses into periods and episodes of psychosis. For the last 11 months, he's been interned here consistently in solitary confinement, partly to protect him from the other inmates as he is a target. Partly also, I don't know the other reasons he's been in there. There seem to be a number of tiers of solitary confinement in the jail, and the worst is called, interestingly, the safety cell. I understand in prison and other places it's actually called the hole, and it's the last place you want to be sent. I didn't know this at the time that an attorney visited the jail and observed my son in this cell. He was naked on a cement floor with a thin quilt wrapped around him in fetal position. I was told he had wounds, but you couldn't really see them because he was wrapped in this blanket. He was not speaking, he was not eating, and he was not drinking water. On Sunday, January 22nd, that was Sunday, January 2nd, 3.5 days later, he was moved to the psychiatric health facility in Santa Barbara, where he spent a day and a half. And then he was sent back here to that same cell. I understand from the research I've done that any individual in a state of psychosis or any individual on the autism spectrum who's put in a state of prolonged isolation will only go farther and farther and deeper into their illness. And this is what has happened to my son. I've been told that the wounds on him were self-inflicted, but I'll get to that in a minute. On January 30th, I met with a commander from the jail and a doctor from the mental health contractors who work here for the jail. They told me that the reason he had been put in that cell was because he had attempted suicide for the second time since August. I was a little bit heartened when I heard that, thinking of course he would be seeing a counselor. But there is no counseling available to people who attempt suicide in this jail. There's only counseling for drug and alcohol abuse and issues. When they said that he was again not talking, I asked them if he was eating or drinking and was told they didn't know. I asked, well, I already told you about the counseling. The next day I called the jail, and Ben was being transported to Cottage Hospital, where he was intravenously fed water and fluids. He had not been eating or drinking for I think it was 4 to 5 days that he'd been back in the jail. The next day I discovered he was back at the psychiatric health facility. On February 4th, I visited Ben. I was able to see him at the psychiatric facility. He's lost approximately 80 pounds. He's covered his face, his arms and legs with wounds, big open wounds, scratches, a cut down the inside of his bicep this long with stitches in it. I don't know how this happened. I've been told it was self-inflicted with his fingernails. He's never self-mutilated, and I don't really know how that happened to him. I do want to know what happened to my son in jail. These physical wounds don't even touch how far, far away he's gone in his psychosis. I'm hoping now that he's being medicated that he might start to resurface over time and with a great deal of therapy, compassion, and love. I really believe this. I believe there are at least 2 guards in this jail who saved my son's life. And I am grateful to those guards. There are others who have been less kind. They know who they are. And like Ben, who once was and who in time will rise from the ashes and soar again as a beautiful human being he is, they need to learn what happened to Ben and why. And they need to own that they were part of that. I think we all do, because we've all been passive in allowing the mentally ill to be treated like this. And the more people who know this, the less likely it is to continue to occur. We're dealing with a broken system treating broken people. The mentally ill, by and large, don't belong in this jail, but they're being warehoused there. Estimates are, the statistics are astounding at how many people in this jail have issues that just need loving treatment. A dear friend recently wrote to me saying of Ben's situation, "People are gathering around you to help you fight social injustice. Ben is like the canary in the coal mines. It feels like there's a spiritual circling of the wagons. It's affecting all of us differently, and some of us the same. It's time for us to reach out to one another and work to put our lives and our systems that are broken back into some sort of meaningful, compassionate, and functional order." My son could be your son. He could be your brother. He could be your father. I personally believe in the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I've made mistakes in my life, big mistakes. It's not for me to judge those who have so injured my son. This is the terrain of their own consciousness and their own hearts. Another creed I live by is that there are no truly negative acts or events. There are only lessons to be learned. There are big lessons here to learn. As things stand now, everyone here is probably in agreement that mental disorders and criminal justice can present a deadly combination. This combination has nearly taken my son's life. It is unfair to all of us to continue allowing the mentally ill to be warehoused in the jails where the reasons for their behaviors are going untreated and worsening. People who are sick belong in hospitals. You are all here because on some level you all care. You care about my son, and you care about helping to make a difference, helping to stop this and not allow any other person with mental illness be treated the way my son has been treated here. We all know in our hearts this does not have to be so. We do not have to tolerate this. Santa Barbara County is poised to take a leadership position in California, this country, and the world. If we join hands and we work together, we allow our hearts to speak. Our hearts, not our egos and not our checkbooks. Our hearts have to start doing the talking. We are going to create a true judicial, healthful, and compassionately correctional justice here in Santa Barbara County. I prayed that as this day approached, I would be given guidance and the words would come to me. This morning I woke to discover an email from the mother of a girl my son first loved. One amazing aspect of this gift is that it allows me to share Ben's own words in talking with you today. Words that come straight from his heart. From Amanda, who wrote me, "Please pass this on to Ben's mom. I found a journal Ben sent me and some letters he included. This part of a letter really spoke to me. My hope for Ben is that he is able to get back to this mentality." From Ben in 2007. Oh, and the remedy for your boredom, might I suggest reading? I think The Art of Compassion by the Dalai Lama is awesome. It can teach you to accept others who are mean, I might add. Gotta have compassion for people or you'll never get by. There's this one thing a friend of the Dalai Lama said after being tortured and imprisoned. To solve his imprisonment, he had compassion for his torturers, not anger. Replace anger with compassion and you get a happier person. Then Amanda wrote, "There is good in the world. It just gets harder to find as the years go by. Ben is one of the few good people left in our world." I'm now going to introduce Madeline Sharples, who's going to talk to us about some of her experiences.
I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to speak to you and to support Nancy Spears' efforts in bringing attention to Ben's situation. My goal since my son's death by suicide in 1999 has been to erase the stigma of mental illness and suicide through awareness and education in hopes of saving lives. Our son Paul had just turned 21. He was a senior in college in New York when he had his first manic break. One day he was perfectly fine. He was back in California playing the piano for his grandmother's birthday. 2 weeks later, he was calling us up every few minutes, writing all over his walls with a black felt-tip marker, throwing $20 bills out the window, and saying people were lurking in hallways and alleyways out to get him and poisoning his cigarettes and food with drugs. He was a jazz musician, no longer able to sit long enough at the piano to play a tune through from start to finish. The doctors who diagnosed our sons with bipolar disorder said it was caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain and triggered by stress. It usually hits young people in their late teens and early 20s. Another cause was genetic. They credited my family's history of depression and manic depression. And because he was an adult and I had no control over his actions or what happened to him, he refused to give us legal conservatorship. I could only care for him if he let me. He only went in hospital on his own accord. I cuddled him, rubbed his back, but I couldn't spoon feed him like I did when he was a baby. As much as we tried to get him to take his medications, putting them out for him in daily doses or sprinkling them on his ice cream to make them more palatable, He took them sporadically and later not at all. Even his girlfriend's threat to leave him if he stopped taking his medications didn't convince him to stay on them. He was an adult. He controlled his destiny. When his doctors or we called the police to hospitalize him, he was a master at acting normal. He wouldn't let them see he was a danger to himself or to others. In fact, up until the day he died by suicide, he worked in his normal disguise. I knew he was depressed. I worried. I saw him. He was living at our home the last 2 years of our lives. But he didn't let his father or me help him. And at that time, I didn't know what a deadly illness he had. Please don't make the same mistake with Ben Warren. He is a danger to himself. Something his jailers just haven't seemed to have taken into account. He needs hospitalization and medication to get his moods back in balance. He may be an adult, but he's not acting as an adult and taking care of himself. He needs the care of the right professionals to help him survive. Thank you.
And Carrie Bowers is going to speak now and share some important information.
My name is Carrie Bowers. My son Taylor is 23, and our story today begins with Ben Warren, but it really is an international crisis of vast proportions and certainly is a civil rights issue. My son often reminded me actually of Ben and what a beautiful, talented, creative, and compassionate soul is Ben Warren. And I'm often reminded in this story that as it's come down, how my son, when he had his interfacing when he was 18, 19, 20 with the police officers in our community, we had advocated for training for our first responders. And so his encounter with law enforcement turned out quite differently. Education is key. It is so incredibly powerful. And what we see instead is a lack of education in the judicial system, from first responders, from our district attorney's offices down to judges, pro tem judges, etc., and including the people that are included as are the psychologists who intervene. Very often they don't understand the nuances that they are there to protect and to adjudicate upon. And so instead, we have today an incredible quandary in our judicial system. The number of incarcerated men and women with severe mental illness has grown tremendously in the past few decades, that prisons are now considered the largest mental health providers in this country. The impact of prison is worse for prisoners whose thinking and emotional responses are impaired by things such as schizophrenia, bipolar disease, major depression, autism, and other serious mental illnesses. The mentally ill in prison also face inadequate mental health services, as demonstrated by this situation with Ben here in Santa Barbara, that leave them undertreated and or mistreated. Of course, there's inherent tensions between the security mission of prisons and the mental health considerations of these individuals, as well as the fiscal problems that we face as a nation today that greatly impede our ability to educate, to intervene, and to get the services that the people with mental illness desperately deserve. Safety, power, control, staff concerns makes coordinating the needs of the mentally ill, whose rules and goals nearly impossible. Because the proportion of prisoners with mental illness is increasing, the high number of growing proportion of persons with mental illness in U.S. prisons are unintended and tragic consequences of inadequate community mental health services. Numerous studies and surveys have certainly documented the rise in the incarceration of the mentally ill. The Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that 16% of adult inmates in state prisons and local jails are mentally ill. And there are 3 to 4 times as many mentally ill people in prisons than in mental health hospitals, and the rate of mental illness in prison is 2 to 4 times greater than in the general public. The crisis in the mental health system in the United States has undoubtedly contributed to the number of mentally ill prisoners. Left untreated and unstable, people with serious mental illnesses, particularly those who are poor, homeless, and suffering from untreated alcoholism and drug addiction, may break the law and then enter criminal justice systems. And a very large preponderance of these individuals were found to be homeless a year before their incarceration. The failure of the mental health system and the judicial system has led to what some have called the criminalizing of mentally ill individuals. So in closing, I say it is imperative that we have first responders, judges, DAs, criminal justice systems to find the education, to seek the education, and that we impart the education that they so desperately need. Again, this is a civil rights issue, and our collective mission is to bring together a national light on this tragedy. And it begins here with Ben Warren in Santa Barbara, and we intend to take that around the world and to increase the awareness of this horrible circumstance. Thank you.
Now we have Debbie Ulrich, another mom.
Thanks, Nancy. Good afternoon. My name is Debbie Ulrich, and I'm a former deputy sheriff and a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm also the mother of a 21-year-old son who is in prison, and these words are still very difficult for me to get out. But Zachary was a child that was normal in every way. He did really well in school and was very athletic, but at age 19 he experienced his first psychotic episode. We took him to a leading clinic in Southern California, and he was diagnosed with substance-induced psychosis, and specifically cannabis. We began the arduous trial and error of finding psychotropic meds that would give symptom relief. After about 9 months of having treatment and also just the meds, he still was psychotic and delusional. He was then given a very high dosing of a very powerful antipsychotic. The hallucinations and delusions continued, and Zach abruptly went off his meds, in which he didn't sleep for 3 days, and it led him to be extremely manic and commit an offense that ended with his first and only arrest. Once incarcerated, he was put on new psychotropic meds that's part of a formulary that they use at Santa Barbara County Jail, still without any symptomatic relief. Approximately 3 months into his incarceration, he refused medication. The abrupt stopping of his meds led him again into a very manic state. He called us from jail saying that he was in unbelievable pain and thought he was going to die. He had not again slept in 3 days. We visited him, and he was clearly manic. All of a sudden, he said, "I'm burning up," and during visitation, he removed his shirt. The sergeant on duty was enraged and ran out of his booth, yanking the phone from my husband's hand, and began yelling at Zach, who by that time had already put his shirt back on. We didn't learn until after the visit that he was placed in isolation for this violation and remained there for 5 weeks. I know that in isolation, and I think Nancy mentioned it also, that nearly all thinking is fantasy, and there's no feedback to reality check in a state of an aroused emotion. And I also know that officers lack the proper training in the treatment of psychiatric disorders, which is really understandable because this should not be a primary function of correctional officers anyway. These events have been very traumatic to our son and to our family, but what makes the situation tragic is what ensued next. You see, we worked endlessly to find out what the best treatment option would be for Zach and for his return as a productive citizen. After a number of assessments, all documented, county probation, county mental health, the judge in the case, and the court-appointed psychologist all agreed that Zach would be best suited to residential treatment over prison. I quote the court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Owens, who stated, "Zach does not have a criminal record, and in fact, there are no signs that he is a criminally oriented man. Instead, he is a mentally ill individual." Later, he stated, "Fortunately, he is not an immoral, psychopathic man who typically violates the rights of others, but instead suffers from psychotic symptoms that can be controlled with proper medication." Everything was in place for Zach to get treatment. Sanctuary House in Santa Barbara assessed him as well and determined that he was suitable for treatment. We were asked by Zach's public defender to reserve his bed space at our expense. Literally 4 days before this was to take place, the DA's office changed their mind and Zach signed a plea agreement while actively hallucinating that result in a 5-year prison sentence. Because he was an adult, we were powerless to change this. County Mental Health and myself met with the DA's office to plead with them to change their minds, but they wouldn't budge. Our son was sent to prison while actively psychotic. While being assessed in prison, they determined that he had no mental illness. This was after my husband... Okay. It's good because I lost my place. Let's see. My son was sent to prison while actively psychotic. While being assessed in prison, they determined that he had no mental health needs. This after my husband had hand-delivered all of Zach's mental health history to the prison. He has been in state prison now for nearly 1 year and has not received any mental or medical help. He's being housed at taxpayers' expense of about $50,000 a year, over being treated at his family's expense. Does any of this make sense to you? I think it's such a travesty of justice. By housing the mentally ill in our county jail and our state prisons, we're making a very costly mistake. As a mother, a concerned citizen, and a taxpayer, we're calling for the city and the county of Santa Barbara to begin to work together to address this crisis that we face. We need residential options, not punitive measures that pump up our criminal justice budget and contribute to an endless revolving door for so many people with mental health or substance abuse disorders. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. We now have words from Coco, who can give you a very startling story of her own.
Hello, my name is Corinne Neal. People call me Coco. I'm here as a community organizer. I have a master's in social work with a 3.9 average, and I also have a mental illness. I have bipolar disorder. And I'm here not just as a social worker, I'm here as a survivor. I experienced a bad combination, mental illness and jail. This occurred in another state, and it is my feeling that inhumane treatment in jails is epidemic. And it's almost like jails are secret societies where inhumane treatment can occur without oversight. I know because I experienced it firsthand. I went to jail because I didn't pay a cab fare, and I endured 2 weeks of hell in that time. My symptoms were active at that time. I was in the manic phase of bipolar, and I was not given any psychiatric medication when I asked for it. I have high blood pressure. I was not given blood pressure medication the whole time I was there. I'll never forget the night the guard told me, "I'm going to put you in the hole." Why? I was dry heaving. I was so upset, and she didn't like it. I was making noise. And she said, "I'm going to put you in the hole." I was so scared. I've seen movies about the hole. And I just thought, she's going to put me in some cement room. I did go into just a typical isolation cell with a toilet and a cot, but isolating me did not help the situation. I was never assessed by a mental health professional, and things just got worse. First of all, you know, the smell in jail is a combination of body odor and feces. It smells like gas. The cells are filthy. There are blood stains. You know, and I wasn't in my right mind while I was there. The whole situation was just so traumatic. I was having symptoms where I would stand on my table and talk incessantly. I was sitting on the floor in my own urine, and no one would come to my aid. And no one visited me the entire time. I felt totally abandoned. At one time, I was sitting on the floor playing in my urine, and no one took any action. The way they would control me was this. The guards would come into my cell and say, sit down on your cot. You know, I was being compliant. I sat down, and I was sprayed in the eyes with pepper spray and hogtied with metal shackles, told to put my face down on the mattress and shut up. This happened several times. I couldn't sleep. I would wake up screaming. I had hives up and down my arms and back because I was so anxious. I was naked the whole time. They give you a special safety Velcro suit when you're in a psychiatric phase in a jail, and it wouldn't stay on me. I was naked in my cell the whole time. Then the other girls that would walk by my cell, they told me they were being raped in the jail by the guards. I was allowed no phone calls. You know, the overwhelming thought I had was, does anyone know I'm here? Could they possibly kill me? You know, that was in my mind, like a terrifying thought. Could they kill me? I was, in a word, I was terrorized. And, you know, there are no clocks or calendars in jail, so it was an endless horror. I was eventually transferred after this ordeal to a state psychiatric hospital. I was in such a state of traumatization and abuse that I had to be restrained, and I was just constantly screaming for help. And so I ask for your help today. Please bring awareness to the fact that some people with mental illness go to jail where their symptoms are not treated, where their symptoms are exacerbated by jail. We believe here today that treatment is the solution and incarceration is not. Treatment, not jail. Incarceration will fail. I just hope that this community will rally together so that there's oversight in the jail here today and going forth, so that we have residential treatment and a continuum of care in our community to protect those vulnerable who have mental illness. Thank you.
Our next speaker is James Roberts.
My name is James Robertson. I'm a member of the board of the Santa Barbara chapter of the ACLU, and I served for years as the ombudsperson for the local jail. Of all the problems one can encounter in our jail and in California prisons, jails and more generally, the issue we are here addressing today is the most serious and egregious. Placing mentally ill individuals in solitary confinement cells is a dangerous and degrading means of dealing with people who should be under the care and supervision of mental health professionals. Even for people who are not mentally ill, solitary confinement has been proven through numerous studies to actually cause mental illness as a result of the deprivation of human contact. Moreover, protracted solitary has been rightly condemned as a form of cruel and inhuman treatment and a violation of the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The fact that our jail resorts to this tactic of solitary confinement for the mentally ill is evident in the case of Ben Warren, who suffers from psychosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, and Alport syndrome, which is a form of autism. Someone like Ben does not have the capacity to cope with the conditions of incarceration, nor should he or anyone who suffers several mental diseases be subject to them. The jail lacks the resources and professional services to provide adequate and safe conditions for someone like Ben, and uses solitary to compensate for that lack. Calling it protective custody simply illustrates the inadequacy and inappropriateness of jail confinement for the mentally ill, who are placed in solitary ostensibly for their own safety. For their own safety, they should be in professionally run mental health facilities. The consequences of solitary confinement can be, and in Ben's case already have been, grave, notably exacerbated psychosis, fear, and self-injurious behavior, and significantly increasing the risk of suicide. Suicide rates among people who have been kept in solitary are far higher than the general population. These consequences are entirely avoidable by a change in policy to desist from incarcerating the mentally ill. There are numerous societal reasons for opposing solitary confinement. As well, the cost of solitary confinement is vastly greater than confinement in regular cells, and the recidivism rates of those who have been in solitary are demonstrably higher. These adverse social costs are compounded by the degradation and harmful treatment of society's most vulnerable members. Solitary confinement is inhumane, wasteful, ineffective, and dangerous. The ACLU is working to challenge its long use and overuse. Specifically, our position includes the following: to use solitary confinement only in exceptional cases for as short a time as possible. To prohibit under all circumstances the use of solitary confinement for prisoners suffering from mental illness and developmental disabilities. To require regular mental health evaluations for prisoners confined in solitary, and to require prompt removal of those who develop signs of mental illness. To mitigate extreme isolation by allowing some human interaction with staff or others, and by allowing some access to the outside world in the form of books, magazines, television, radio, and other media. Thank you. I have copies for the press if they want them, and also this is the last week in which we're gathering signatures to abolish the death penalty. If anybody hasn't signed a petition, please see me. Thank you.
Hello, I'm here with my friend Linda Orozco. My name is Sharon Rose, and I'm helping Linda. I'm going to read her speech because she has suffered so much stress from this ordeal with her son that she's now having physical symptoms herself. So please bear with me. I'm going to read for Linda. All right, my name is Linda Orozco. I'm here to talk about my son, Michael, who has mental illness. Currently, he is a resident at Phoenix House and doing very well. It took over 10 years to get him to the place he is now. He was a loving, caring person who loved family, his life, his friends. He loved to read and cook. He used to cook for everybody. He said he wanted to be a chef one day. But all that began to spiral downhill when he showed signs of mental illness. I tried to help him. He became a client of ADMHS, but when his case manager moved away, they abandoned him. They switched his diagnosis to substance abuse, and when ADMHS was having serious financial problems, everything changed. Somehow he was lost in the system. Instead of treatment and a plan of direction, he was now in jail.
The district attorney, his probation officer, and ADMHS case manager secretly arranged a court meeting and offered him a plea bargain for a short term in prison. Later that day, my son called me from jail and told me the news. He told me, "Don't worry," because the case manager said he would have ice cream and pancakes in prison. A terrible injustice happened to my son. Upon release, he was assured to be a client of ADMH Cares, but he was denied services. I had to advocate for him to continue receiving services. It has been a horrifying ordeal. The other day we were driving and my son said to me, he said, "Mom, I don't know why I was in there. They treated me very bad. I was beat up and pushed against the wall for talking to myself. He placed me in the safety room where there is no bed, blanket, or sink, just a hole in the ground and a cold floor to lay on with no clothes. It's awful." Another time he was an inmate helper. He was told if there was anything he felt he could not do, he should tell them. One day he was told to clean up vomit from a van. It had been a hot day and the smell was unbearable. He felt he was going to be sick to his stomach, so he told the officer he could not do it. They strapped him down and again placed him in the safety cell for 3 days, without food or water. He remembers yelling and banging on the door. He says he did not have food or water. He was placed in an area they place the worst criminals, where the inmates are being watched. He was beat up, his jaw was broken, and his body bruised, yet he had no treatment. He was told by the head officer that if he ever returned to that area, he would be sorry. Is this the way to treat people with mental illness? To this day, he does not understand the ordeal and talks about the good place he is in now, how he is treated with respect and he likes his room. But he fears going back to jail. We need more places like Phoenix House and residential treatment because there are so many people who would benefit from receiving treatment. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Beverly Grant, and I have been in criminal justice work for 38 years until I retired, and I've spent most of my time in Santa Barbara County since 1977. I would like to tell you that this is not just a current event. This is not just a current happening. This began when it was determined by some psychiatrists and psychologists that the mentally ill can be treated on the street by being given medication. And the main mental health facilities were closed all at once. Boom, closed. Now, as the local parole agent, I would like you to know what happened. Once I had someone delivered from one of the prisons in a straitjacket. He was driven into the yard. They took off the straitjacket and said, "Go through that door and your parole agent will take care of you." I would like to make this point strongly. This is not the jail's fault. It is the fact that we, in a big fit to save money, destroyed the mental health system in the late 70s. There are many people, many people. This is just a tiny sampling. I was told that I was responsible for some of these people. I had, instead of getting up and being at someone's house at 6 o'clock in the morning because they were a child molester, I'm driving up and down the streets looking for a mentally ill person to take to get his shots, because many mentally ill people cannot on their own go and get their own shots. So I would have to find the person who may be sitting in the alley eating Pickles pig feet out of a jar and coax him into the car, take him to get his shot. That is a poor waste of my time. It is a poor waste of their life to be sitting on the street with no help and no supervision of any kind. You know, the criminal justice system has never been set up to handle the mentally ill, and yet when we don't have a hospital to put them in, everybody thinks it's okay to dump them in the jail and let the jails deal with it, and then everybody gets to criticize the jail. They weren't set up to handle the mentally ill. And we're going to have to up some money, a whole bunch of money in fact, And I feel as economic conditions get worse and we see more homeless people on the street, we become inured to people suffering. We better wake up pretty soon and find out what's really important. Because every time we pass a homeless person who doesn't even have anything, we are made less. We are all being made less by this. On another occasion, I had a man come in who was on parole, delivered to my office, who was so mentally ill, he sewed his penis to his pants. Now, I'd like to say, what would you all do to handle that? I'm not prepared to handle that. No one in my office is prepared. No one in here is prepared to handle that. This is set up to handle people who violate the law, period. If there are mental health components, they don't have any place to take them, and they don't have anybody to see them when they get there. So it is a matter of a mass reallocation of funds, which if we are as good as we think we are, we have to move on, and move on it now.
Bravo!
Up until I was invited to be here, I thought that my kids had experienced the most horrible lives, the most difficult issues. My name is Lourdes Uribe, and I'm a Latino parent of 5 children. Some of them experience difficulties with learning, emotional, and developmental disabilities. I had to deal with the school system, with the juvenile system. My kids have never experienced, thank God, such a horrible experiences that, like the ones that I heard. I guess my message here today is that it is time for the city, county, and all people together to join and do something for these children, for these young men. When I read the article in the paper about Ben, my heart just suffered because I thought of my own children. I know that there's shortage of money. I know that it is difficult to do what is right, but I just read a quote in the paper the other day where it said the test of the morality of a society is what it does for its children. They're young men, they're people that are in need of services and care. I don't believe that the juvenile system is the place to go for kids with learning difficulties who don't want to go to school. I don't believe that we should put them in jail. And I believe that they're precious in the sight of God, and that just one human life lost to prison or sickness is just horrible to God. And I appreciate this opportunity to share my experiences. They're nothing compared for what I heard, so I was unprepared for this. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Rose, and I'm the mother of a bipolar person. I want to tell you his story, and our story is a success story. It took a long time. I am executive director of a local nonprofit organization that works on affordable housing, and for 20 years before that I developed public health prevention programs for at-risk children and families. For about a year and a half I was interim coordinator of the Santa Barbara County Drug and Alcohol Prevention Program. I'm the mother of a bipolar asthmatic who took asthma drugs as a baby. He was self-medicating with alcohol and marijuana by age 14. My son was in and out of treatment for 25 years. He at times spent a few days in jail, at the most a week. He always refused to take psychiatric medication even though it was prescribed, saying if he took them it stole his soul. After a bad traffic accident in which someone lost their life, my son was severely depressed for 10 years. He leaned on substances. He lost job after job and numerous homes. As an electrician, he could always find work, but not keep the jobs. He was headed for the streets again, and my daughter and I feared he would commit suicide. Finally, we got him into a religious rehab facility in the desert. It was not fancy, but it was a new environment out in nature, supervised by loving people. He worked outside and got healthy. He dug holes for punishment when his anger came out toward others. He went to church and learned to think of others, not just himself. There was strict discipline, but it was mixed with love and caring. Around the campfire, he heard stories of recovery. Most of the men working there were in recovery. This low-cost model of staffing a residential treatment center also provided jobs for those in recovery. The first few months, there was no contact with family or friends, and in the second phase, they got to get jobs and live in supervised housing for 6 to 8 months. After graduation, the church stayed close to these guys and helped them overcome the stigma of their past. They remained in a loving community and were treated like normal people. I really believe that stepped residential treatment works because it worked with my son. It works for a variety of populations with mental and or substance issues. My son is happy. He's a triathlete now. His children are thriving. But his mental problems were not severe. There are some who will not respond to treatment in the same way he did. We know that. Some will need longer-term supportive housing and residential treatment. This problem is complex. The solutions are not simple. As our sheriff has said, this jail is a de facto institution for the mentally ill in the place of no alternative. Prison health systems, Corizon, could they do better? Hopefully, but oversight is needed. My question is, can we think outside of the box to find funding for treatment facilities and supportive housing? Job training, jobs, and supportive housing are needed. Some will never live independently. Programs like Homeboy Industry provide a model for reducing jail populations and the need for more jails. It is not enough to say we don't have the money. We are appealing to donors for a building, land, or a ranch for a residential treatment facility. The resources exist, but we must find them in these difficult times. We also need to look at the root causes and invest in prevention and assist and empower caregivers of people who have special needs. Nothing we're saying here today is new. Ben Warren was not a career car thief. He should not have been treated like one. As a society, we cannot afford to continue to fail these people. Let's form a work group and work together to solve this problem. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Suzanne Reardon, and I'm director of a local nonprofit called Families Act. And the ACT part stands for Advocating for Compassionate Treatment. And Families Act came out of a tragedy, a cluster of deaths among young, dually diagnosed adults in Santa Barbara County in the winter of 2005 and 2006. My son Ian died at 23 years old that winter. He was dually diagnosed. He had struggled for 9 years with depression and anxiety and was self-medicating and was finally doing better. He had a full-time job with the Carpenters Union and he felt so proud of himself. But the foreman invited him over one night for a drink, and one drink turned into many drinks. And 5 days later, when my son went to get to be drug tested, because he was still on probation for a few more weeks. He was going to finally be off of probation, but they found a dirty drug test. And my son disappeared that night, and his body was found 3 weeks later on Parker Way, where another young man, also named Ian, fell to his death just a few weeks ago in Santa Barbara. Our children's death put me on a mission, put me on a path, and it's a mission to find out why people who are not criminals are being jailed. Because I really feel strongly that the reason my son died that night was that he thought he was going to have to go to prison for that dirty test. That's what they tell you. Even if your only offense is using drugs, they tell you that one more time and you're going to prison. I visited this jail many, many times to visit my son and a number of other young adults and not so young adults that are not criminals. So I started to do some research. We formed a task force. We started to map the gaps in our community and look at the history of this situation. Where did this all begin? And I want to show you this chart. Okay, this is a chart of the percentage of jail and prison inmates with serious mental illness in the U.S. Okay, this here is 1980. It begins in 1980, right here. A lot of people with mental illness in the jails, in the prisons in the United States of America. Okay, down here in 1880, suddenly they're not in prison anymore. They're not in jail. Where are they? They're in mental hospitals because of a woman named Dorothy Dix, who did a lot of work persuading all the decision makers that we needed facilities to treat mental illness. Okay, and then what happened? Suddenly, in 1980, right around here, well, earlier actually, once again, the people with mental illness ended up once again incarcerated. And why is that? Well, like Beverly told us, and like other people have told us today, the mental hospitals were closed. The mental hospitals were closed in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. Then a number of very draconian drug laws were passed, and minimum sentencing and mandatory sentencing in the 80s and the 90s, and the result is what we see here today. Here's the result. 1 out of 31 Americans today is sitting behind bars on probation or on parole. 1 out of 31 people, so it'd be 1 out of the people assembled here. That's how many Americans are either incarcerated or have a probation officer who is allowed to show up at their house at any time of the day or night, put them in handcuffs, shackle them right then and there, and search their house. They show up in uniform with their guns. The neighbors ask, what's going on? This is not right. Now, like Beverly said, it's not really the fault of our sheriff. It's not really the fault of our criminal justice system. This is a very complex problem. But the Families Act has put together a 50-page report going over the history of this situation nationally, and then mapping the gaps in our own community of Santa Barbara. And we have asked for a meeting with the county CEO. Twice we've been given an appointment, and it's been canceled at the last minute. So we are requesting now a meeting with the county CEO who is looking at the situation and wondering what can be done to save costs. What is the matter with this revolving door syndrome? We're calling today for our city council members and our county supervisors to work together to create a work group this week, as soon as humanly possible, to work together to address the crisis that we are facing in Santa Barbara. Our explosion of people who are homeless, and our overcrowded jails, and our high spikes in suicide rates and drug overdose rates, which are not even known to most people, are all symptoms of the same problem: untreated illness. And so we have a lot of ideas. We've thought about it carefully, and we want to share these with our decision makers. And we're going to be having a meeting coming up very soon. I hope that we got everybody's email addresses, because we want to pick a night that works for everyone. We want to have a meeting of stakeholders that are affected by this problem, and that can, and the policymakers that can change this situation. We'd like a representative from the City Council, a representative from the county supervisors, and someone from the county CEO office to attend our meeting. And we're going to work on this together. Thank you so much.
Do we want to do? Yeah. Do we have any questions? If not, thank you very much, everyone, for coming and for your support. Thank you so much. Hope to see you again.